I'm going to go ahead and turn your microphone on. Michael's dialing in. How are you doing, Mark?
Oh, I'm doing great. Good to hear your voice, Jeannie, as always.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm glad that you called in today. Michael and you are going to talk about the Beatitudes. And anybody who would like to have a copy of that, you can go to our website, whyagain.org, and if you click on the worksheets, or there again, like I said, the Start Here or the Bullseye, the Beatitudes poster is in that list. So you can scroll down past the Reality Management Wake-Up Sheets, and then there will be the Beatitudes listed in the other worksheets. And we've got every worksheet for every workshop listed there. So you can click on the Beatitudes, and it brings up the poster. You can print it off. You can read it from the website. We also sell them on a really nice parchment-type paper. But that is what the discussion is going to be about today, and we're excited about that. I don't know if Michael's having a challenge getting in here. Let me just double-check with him. All right.
All right. Well, you should be able to hear me, sweetie.
I can hear you now, and Mark is already with us. I've got his microphone on.
Oh, cool. Well, I had a bit of a challenge getting on, but we're here. Welcome, Mark. How do you be, sir?
Oh, very well. Thank you. Great to be here with you both.
Well, delighted to hear your voice. We haven't heard you on the show in a while.
It's good to be with you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
So I invited Mark to call into the show today as a result of a StillPoint breathing session that I did on Saturday. And in that StillPoint breathing session, I just had I shared a little bit, I think, on Monday about it, a really deep experience of energetic movement within my structure. And Mark has created, he's been doing this work for several years now, and he created a Beatitudes podcast sort of thing that he had shared with me, and I had been listening to it. And during my StillPoint session, I just had, all the people I've worked with over the years, Mark, you just came in so powerfully, and I actually stepped out of my StillPoint session, and at least the awareness of it, to send you a text right in the middle of it. The guidance was so strong to just share that with you. And so that's what led to us being on the show today. I had suggested that instead of us having just a private conversation, we have one that might be fruitful for the whole community to listen to, and of course to be in the archives for future access. So that's kind of why I'm here. How about you, Mark? Any thoughts to share?
I would say
before we
I would
step
say
into that.
I would say that the attitudes have been a real center point for me over the last handful of years. And it's reflective, of course, in all of your work, Michael. But there was something about the conciseness of these Beatitudes that really spoke to me and helped me navigate back in 2011 to 2014 when I was navigating a mental health crisis. It was these core tools that really, kind of gave me a roadmap, a guide of where I was headed. And it was to a good place. I'm fully healthy today and everything, but there was this desire that birthed in me to do what I could to let people know, hey, these are active tools that we can bring into our lives that will help us, really move into our very best life. So it's a huge passion of mine. I love sharing it. I love talking about it. And I am by no means in what I would consider an expert in it. I'm a practical applier of it. And so I know that, there's a lot more that I can even learn. And one of the reasons we put out the Beatitudes practice was to start a conversation and to include people with perspectives, to kind of expand that. How do these really benefit our society and our families and us individually?
Right.
So that's what I have to say on it to start.
Cool. Sweet. Well, I'm going to just read my text. And I was in a totally altered state when you just came in so powerfully, and the guidance was to share the thoughts with you. So what I had written to Mark was, a deep StillPoint session was guided to give you a message about reforming your practice of the Beatitudes. And as we said, Mark's really been working with them. The first one is not Rukha as just the breath. There are several translators of the Aramaic language that translate this word Rukha as the breath, and particularly as it relates to the Beatitudes. And in the Aramaic, it actually it's the breath as one of the eternal forces from the Creator. And when we think about the Aramaic, where the Greeks tell us that God sent out His Spirit, in Aramaic doesn't say this, it says God sent out His breath. And there are translators of the Aramaic that just translate this word as breath. And the offering what I was guided to offer to Mark was that it's Rukha is not just the breath, but that's just one aspect of living in these eternal forces from the Creator. And that ultimately we must yield to all of the eternal forces from God, again called in Aramaic Rukha. When we let go of the limited Greek idea, Yeshua would say it's all Greek to me, ideas brought to us by many interpreters who've not done the requisite inner work of his Aramaic words, just being about the breath, you can open literally to all of the eternal forces. These forces, when undistorted, and in the process at that point, I was shown, I could actually literally feel and for those who've been in an intensive, we teach energy field work that we've taught for several decades for returning the core antenna structure of the body, which is the bony structure of the head, the spine, the pelvis, the arms, and the legs. The bones are literally, at least my take, an antenna, and that there are energetic inclinations that come through that antenna. But when carbon-based memory holds something related to that in some form of hostility or fear, greed, grief, pain, trauma, then what happens is that we distort that message, as it were, that inclination. So the rest of the text is offered these forces, when undistorted and uninhibited, move, yes, even the bones of your skull, to incline your behavior toward Rukha's ends rather than those of the past, stored in carbon-based memory and projected into perception. And so recognizing that there are many of these eternal forces, and the first Beatitude, it's traditionally interpreted by the Greeks as you whose home, the traditional interpretation, blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. And, if we listen to Yeshua, there's a point where he talks about, the main thing is to stay connected to this eternal force that he's working to connect us with. In fact, he even says, you can deny me, but stay connected to that. And these eternal forces literally are the energetic impetus, as I understand it, towards certain behaviors. And the Greeks said we were supposed to be poor in that, which is kind of senseless in the context. But when you realize that the word maskini, which in Aramaic is home, that a fly speck on a piece of paper changes that word from home to poor. And one of the ways we know that, there'll be a lot of Western scholars say, oh, no, it was all written down in Greek first, then it was translated into Aramaic. Well, when you look at that one word and you realize that it's kind of senseless to want to be poor in that which Yeshua said his whole purpose was to connect us to, then realize in the Aramaic, the primacy of the Aramaic, that his invitation was that rather than living in the perceptual constructs of our mind, rather than living in carbon-based memory projections, that literally our home, like the place where we gather the nourishment, the impetus, the inclination toward behavior is from these literal eternal forces from the Creator. Or in Aramaic, it's also the word Rukha is translated as the active forces from the Creator. And that what mainly came through in that session was just to bring forward the point of there are many of these forces. It's not just the breath. And while the breath is a big key, that we want to keep the breath moving and make that a primary thing, it's also many other forces that come through this form that was designed to respond to those eternal forces. Does that fit? Does that make sense for you, Mark?
Yeah, absolutely. In fact, a couple of notable things on that. And in terms of these active forces, my experience is that God's active forces do show up in a variety of different ways as we're being attuned, as you mentioned. And I know, at least from my lived experience, and you may recall this, but early on before I was introduced to all this, my body was being put into these yoga positions, and there'd be this like crack, and I know in the Aramaic is called the Shem, or this energy force would move through me, and this insight would come, and it was kind of strange and unusual, and I would call it crazy at the time. Today I think it was just an adjustment that was happening after a lot of resistance. I've been in a state of significant resistance. So there was this surrender. And so the surrender into and the allowance of that movement then matured over time. And I remember one day, one of the most unique experiences when I knew I was saved. So this is 2015, and I knew I was sane, and I was telling my then 9-year-old son, Henry, stories every night. And he had asked me, hey, would you tell me a story? Would you tell me a story? After 6 or 7 nights, I was kind of running dry on stories, but needless to say, he asked me again, and that particular night, this voice came through and said, tell him a story, allow the story to come. And so this is another experience of what I would call the active forces of God. So what occurred was I took that breath, and then my lips began to move. But I wasn't of that state that I had known me to be before, moving them. It was like there was a force coming through, this loving force coming through, moving my lips, and then words started to come out. And I was almost listening to the story as it was coming through my lips. And so that is an example that I cherish because it was a beginning, right? And at the end of that story, which was the best story that ever came through my lips up to that point, I turned to Henry and I said, hey, what'd you think? And he gave me a thumbs up and he said, Dad, that was really good. He said, but it's just going to get better. I know you're just learning. From a 9-year-old.
Wow.
And so that's just another example. I mean, these active forces of God can come through us in a variety of ways. And I know in the audio, it's very heavily centric on the breath. And I went back and listened to it after you shared it. It's like, and you're right, it needs to be expanded a bit. I had written about 80 or 90 pages of Beatitudes practice discussion guide. And in there, I break down the words. And certainly, for example, here on page 14, it says, it talks about the English, Aramaic, Greek, and Hebrew, because I'm trying to navigate, all of them. But the opening line here about this word is that it's translated as breath rather than spirit. They can mean breath, wind, what is empty or transitory, spirit, seat of emotion, disposition, life, like all these things. And it goes on to talk about this active force that I pulled from what you had shared many years ago with me, because I know that that's there, but I was thinking when I was putting together these Beatitudes practices that the name that I put on the breath is really kind of that center point from my action. You know, if I hold my breath, I resist these active forces coming through. And so I probably oversimplified it, and there's probably a way to mature that, you know, because it was years ago that I actually did those recordings, and enrich it so that it's more true to what my lived experience is as well.
Sweet. Well, when you talk about that sharing with your son, and my input would be from a previous experience, which I'll share, is that probably your son was right there attuned as you were, and it was probably a cooperative story that came through you. One of the most profound experiences of my life, and the first deep taste of being out of my mind and living in being, was when I caught my daughter as she was being born at home. And when her head delivered into my hands, you know, they say a child can't focus their eyes for several days after birth. She was laser focused, looked in my eyes, and grinned at me. And that put me into a state that was, I mean, I literally had no mind. It was a Friday afternoon. At 3:40 in the afternoon, we realized my wife was in labor. And at 4:40, Christa Joy delivered into my hands. We had a classroom. We lived in Atlanta at the time. I had a classroom in my home, and it was a Friday evening, and at 7 o'clock we were starting a class with people coming from several different parts of the country, and this was back before cell phones. She doesn't like to hear me say it, but 40. She'd been circling the earth for 40 years, but we didn't have cell phones, and there was one person in particular that was driving up from Miami, and I couldn't very well let him arrive at my door and say, too bad, we just had a baby, we're canceling, you drive back to Miami. This was from Atlanta. So at 7 o'clock, newborn baby, 4:40 to 7 o'clock in my arms, walked and, you know, greeted people at the door coming in for the class. They're like, no, she wasn't just born a couple hours ago. No, no. I said, yeah, she was. And I went down to the classroom, and the only way I've been able to describe it and see if this fits for you when you started to tell the story, it was like my mind and my lips had been buttered. I could not think a thought. There was no thought in my mind. There was no activity or action of carbon-based memory. It was just direct transmission, to the point where I didn't know what I was going to say next, and I literally went and got a recorder. Somehow or other in the last 40 years, those recordings disappeared, but I went and got a recorder, and I recorded that whole weekend. I did a 27-hour class that weekend and didn't think a thought the whole weekend. It put me into such an altered state. And, you know, to me, it just ties in. And when you look at the promised result of this first beatitude, the Greeks tell us that you'll be in the kingdom of heaven. In Aramaic, Malkuta Dishmea literally means you'll be in the community of love, at what was called the heavenly estate, that you'll be connected fully to the presence of active love. And I noticed that, you know, as you were describing that opening for you, that's exactly where you were, was in that connected state, and that's exactly what this beatitude promises.
And it, as you know, a beautiful story, by the way, I love that. And as you know, it develops into something that I would say becomes something more consistent. One of the things that for me, because I was coming out of, I would say I was predominantly living in my carbon-based mind, you know, through my life in those middle years, and then had this break or this shift between 2011 and 15 that started in 2011. And then what began to occur is everything became reoriented in my life. And so after the example of sharing with Henry, I went to a business conference, and it would show up there. People would come up and were coming up to me in the conference about a dozen times saying, hey, can I talk to you? And we'd talk, and then I'd hear this voice like, hey, let them, kind of experience this. And they were experiencing it. Of course, I was too, because I was in awe. And as you know, being in that state, it's just this awe state. So I was seeing the bounce from being in that state to being, not as fully in that state. And kind of, so for, probably 18 months or so, just kind of seeing the contrast more and more and more. And some of the other Beatitudes, can help, bring light. If we wanted to talk more about some of the other ones, either today or another time, but can bring more light to the dynamics that were occurring. But it was just a continuation of, I call it a maturing of, a surrendering into allowance, and that piece of making a home in, as the Beatitude begins. One of the things that has become more clear for me in my lived experience is what that means. What does that mean to make a home in, instead of poor in spirit, but to make a home in? And it's really to release all that is in the way of those active forces coming online. And I use the word online with intention because I have had that experience. It's almost like a computer. If you had a computer that was connected to, the most pure source of content, and I know it's not, but from the internet standpoint, let's just say a computer connected to the internet and not connected. Well, if I'm connected to the internet, there's this source of lots of new insights and information and tools, et cetera, that aren't available on a computer that's not connected. Well, if we look at our own life and say, well, wow, there's this source of power and love and just, clarity, et cetera, that is right there for ours to have. But if we judge it, or we're holding on to a past belief that is in conflict, and keeps us, hidden or hides that active force, from us, these Beatitudes actually lift the veil. And they lift that veil and allow for this to come into our being in the way that is most effective for us. Because that's the beauty of this, it's this gentle power that knows that, okay, Michael, your experience of you speaking for 27 hours and teaching without a thought, right? Without a thought of where you're going to go next or what you might say next, but being fully immersed in that presence of pure source coming through, or being that. That was something that obviously has stuck with you for 40 years. And you could tell thousands more stories, I know. But that is an example of how you could receive the active forces of God coming through you in that moment. I think that one of my experiences is, as I've spoken with people who practice this, is it'll show up how you most need to experience it. And that is almost like a birthing of a desire for more. Like, this is amazing, this is incredible, this is powerful, what else? And there's a clearing that happens in those first three Beatitudes that get repeated to really open up to that, allow for the emotions to really move through us and be purified, through Beatitude 2, and allow for this willingness to let things be different than the way that we had perceived it. It's the love of truth challenge, right? But to let, in Beatitude 3, let go of attachment to how we think it is and allow for our life to really expand into what it is that, we're being brought to. But the first three Beatitudes are really clearing, and that's why the fourth Beatitude is those who hunger for this. But there's a clearing that happens that really opens the space and clears out, anything that might be an obstacle to you fully coming into the world, that second coming concept of coming fully in and allowing that Christ consciousness to fully be alive in our life.
Doing the work. Moving from, alternating between being in those that energy experience to being in the constructs of our minds. Go back to Yeshua, he talks about, don't judge by appearances. Every construct of carbon-based memory of the mind is simply construct, and it isn't true except as a reflection of whatever's held in carbon-based memory. So certainly alternating between. I had another opening experience actually a few years before that one with Christa, and it was just such a profound, as what I would call my ego state was trying to get my attention and come back here, hey, look at what I've got. And it was kind of represented by my mind at that time as this playful little puppy that's got something in its mouth that it wants to attract me to, and it's like, I'm going to give this state up for that, thank you very much. And at that point, it was about a year, issues in my life, relationship issues and that sort of things. It was about a year before any of those issues I kind of fell back into some of them and realized that was the next layer of work that I needed to do. But definitely stepping into healing crisis and crossing through it, it's like, which voice are we going to listen to? And that physiologically our structure, if I go back to my early electronics work, the shape of an antenna determines the frequency it receives. And I made reference in that note to you. It was really in the forefront at that point that literally the movement of the antenna, which the core of it, you think about how complex the bones of the cranium are, the connection into the spine. And people think that the baby's soft spot, once it hardens, that the baby's head is fixed, but actually we have a continuously self-adjusting antenna system. Your head, my head, your whole structure is in a state of continuous motion driven by these eternal forces. And when we've been physically or emotionally traumatized, if you remember, the hands-on energy field work from the intensive is designed to break loose physical or emotional trauma in the antenna that restricts its range of motion, that restricts the energy patterns that are designed to come in. And when somebody's been severely emotionally or physically traumatized, then the signals aren't available because literally the antenna is damaged. And in that StillPoint session last Saturday, I could literally feel each bone in my head moving separately at a level that I've never, I've always known it was there and worked with it as an antenna and developed how to adjust it to bring it back into full alignment. But it was just so deeply profound at that moment that these are where the eternal forces come in. These are where the energetic impetus come from, where it's received from source. And if I don't have things in carbon-based memory that distort it, I get that pure inclination, and it's always 100% right on target. If carbon-based memory has resonance with whatever that particular piece of guidance is, then oftentimes we'll fall into carbon-based memories, fear or rage or grief or whatever it happens to be, greed, pain, trauma, we'll fall into that and do that instead, and that's when we're out of alignment with that guidance system. And it was actually the second time through, this goes back now, about the time my daughter was being born, that I got involved in the Aramaic itself. And I can remember sitting and using the dictionary from the Enlightenment book and writing out the Beatitudes longhand. And I actually suggest that to people, that they take that book and use the dictionary and go back and get their own sense of it. But it was, in my world, the training that my carbon-based memory had was, well, the Beatitudes are, a nice philosophy from Yeshua. Well, what I got the second time, I was literally writing it longhand and going back and forth. And at that point, my partner in creating Laws of Living back at that time, Dan McDougald, and I'd go back and forth with him on definitions. And we'd have an hour-long conversation around the simple refinement of one word. And it was the second time writing it out longhand that it was like, this is a set of instructions for how to activate the underlying neural structures that the Creator put in us from the beginning. It's there. it's just been subverted. If we look at that, the word tuvehun, it's a three-part word, and a tuv is this attitude of mind, and there's one that the Creator put in us from the beginning. It's designed to be just like the operating system in a computer, when you use that analogy, it's designed to be the operating system for everything output from the mind. And this is how to bring that operating system back online. That's what this set of Beatitudes are from Yeshua. And I'm planning to go through the whole Beatitudes poster, which, by the way, anybody who's listening, if you want to access it, Jeannie has already put a link into the notes, I'm sure. And so if you go to whyagain.org, and there's a picture of a microphone on the home page, scroll down, hit that, drill down, and you'll find the notes for today, and there'll be a link to the Beatitudes poster, which you can also print off just straight out from our website if you go to whyagain.org. But it's a set of full instructions, and speaks about the work that's going to need to be done.
Absolutely. I wanted to build on that. I love the work that you and Dan and your teams have done over the years to bring this out, and I've not just me, but so many have been the beneficiaries of that. And as I was exploring and navigating, why are these things happening in my healing process? Because I knew the material from the Why Again workshop and had been doing the worksheets, etc. And around the time when this was really coming online for me to investigate, you had suggested the same thing, like, hey, write it out, the definitions, and it was very helpful.
Right.
But I also had
that's a powerful exercise, isn't
it? It's incredibly powerful because it does add depth, and meaning. And one of your other students, Dale Allen Hoffman, did a lot with the Beatitudes, and his work, I looked into, and he's done a remarkable job. And then J.M., who wrote Way of Mastery, has done a remarkable job.
Right.
And so I had the benefit of, and I think it's Douglas Klotz or something had done stuff. I didn't study his as much, but
Neil,
I was really drawn to look at J.M., Dale, and your interpretations, kind of bring them together for me to see, like, okay, why are they using this a little bit differently, or is it the same? And I'll tell you what, once I went through that and got to a clear point, that's what launched the Beatitudes practice. And once I then did the audio part, I started writing this book to kind of get to a deeper understanding. And it was in the writing of the book where I was looking at the Greek and the Aramaic and the English and the Hebrew and stuff, and I realized, it's not that it's wrong, right? It's not, because for a long time, by the way, I used to think, oh my gosh, who is the idiot who wrote down blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven, because it seemed like Greek to me. But one of the things that you said is like, hey, they got one letter wrong, right? So instead of home, they used poor. But when we look at the combination and the true understanding upon reflection, it's like, okay, I could see it in some of these other translations, but it wasn't a complete picture. It was almost like what you pointed out with me with the whole emphasis on the breath rather than the active forces. It was not that it was wrong. It was just incomplete in terms of the full breadth of what could be expressed. And that's how I started to look back and like, okay, it's not that these guys were, translators were the idiots that I had made them out to be. They were just going through the lens of the perceptual worldview that they had at the time when they were doing the translation, and they either missed it, assuming they didn't do it intentionally, that they missed it from the completion of it, the fullness of it, the breadth of it. And what a great time in our history to have more clarity on these Beatitudes practice become available to every person on the planet, because it's needed now more than ever. It's always been there, so it's been right in front of our face, but at least for me, I don't know about you, but prior to really tapping into this Aramaic view, it was very tough to gain any kind of value out of these Beatitudes. As from a humility standpoint, a lot of people have studied this and have put a lot of work out there. A lot of pastors and priests and people have studied Scripture, and they've had their own interpretations of these. But I've never heard it as a practice prior to this work.
Oh, too. And it's not, you go back again to Yeshua, and he says, first of all, in order for his work to be useful to you, you've got to have the eyes to see and the ears to hear. For he who having eyes does not see, and he who having ears does not perceive. In other words, our perceptual constructs can't reflect anything other than what's in them. And so if we don't have the brain cells for what that reflect the brain cells he was working from, then, we can't even tap into what was being said. There's an interesting line. There's a movie out there. It's kind of a violent movie, not very kind, but it's called The Accountant. And it's pretty powerful. But there's a song at the end of it, the thing that impressed me when I heard this. It was like, wow. And the song, the key line in the song at the end of that movie was, you can't read a book that you haven't written. And that's why I suggest to virtually everybody who's interested in Beatitudes that they write it out, because you've got to write it. You've got to develop the brain cells individually before carbon-based memory can serve it up as a perceptual construct. Otherwise, the perceptual construct is going to be off base. And then if you look at, the poster, I assume you've got a copy of the Beatitudes poster, and at the bottom of it, we talk about the first, the greatest and second commandment, and that the instruction there was one of, you've got to have this gateway open in the frontal lobes of the brain that opens a pathway for human life to come into our human form, Rakhma.
Well, and I think that, I apologize if I had just interrupted you. Go ahead.
No, go for it.
Well, you just hit on something that's really, really key. So when someone starts to open up to this practice, there's you may have experiences that are unique. Listen to Michael's story and my story of my son and Michael's, teaching after the birth of his daughter. And again, those are just a couple of thousands of stories we both could tell. But there's a surrender into letting things come forth through you in the adjustment process. I remember one time I was sitting in my bed and my hand moved off of my lap and grabbed a particular book, and I was watching it happen. And it's like, that's interesting. Now this was after I'd already had the yoga experiences where my body was put in the yoga position, so it wasn't that unusual for me. But for most people listening, it's probably kind of unusual. So, but that was part of what needed to happen in that particular moment, and it was just a witnessing. And I often have shared with people that imagine that, and I use my fist just as a symbol. Imagine that the fist represents the core of our being for a moment, and that in that core of our being is that pure essence of that life force, that is keeping us alive. That's animating us, if you will. And then we create these walls and blocks and layers, as everybody listening knows from this work, that we kind of create this outer mask. Well, the outer mask might have a perceptual idea that it is something that's real. And so in the process of going through the Beatitudes, there's a dissolution or dismantling of the outer mask, and that can feel kind of unusual, changing from scary perhaps to holy, if you will, would be to say, hey, it's okay for the outer mask to fall away. It's okay for it to integrate back into the full expression of the life force that's in me. Well, if I'm keeping alive that mask, even if it's unconscious, right? If I'm keeping alive that mask, then that inner force, that life force, is going to find a way if we're willing. And one of the things that we hear in the Beatitudes is it does bring online. It's a practice that activates these life forces coming online, and then there's so much more that comes with the other. We break it down into 10 Beatitudes, and if we can look at the idea that, okay, if that life force was, in my experience with the hand moving, was saying, okay, and it was right after a prayer, by the way. I said, hey, God, if there's a way to heal this, show me the way. I'm yours. I do whatever you want, kind of thing. And it was in that moment, seconds later, that my hand moved and grabbed that book. And it's like, okay, that is the life force. That's the life force saying, okay, you want me to come and be with you and be fully alive, then there's some things that you're going to need to let go of. And for me, I had to let go that the world is the way it is. That was just my path. I perceived that, well, it's this way. This is the way it's always been. This is the way the world is. And so to let go of a perception that the world is, unified already, or perfect as it is, or whatever it is, not perfect in the way that a spiritual person might say, but I had an idea that, something had to be, literally in my mind perfect, right? And that all collapsed. But it took time, because it took a little bit of trust, for example, allowing my hand to move. I could have resisted it. I had the ability to say, I'm going to override this. This is freaking me out. I don't like that my hand's moving apparently on its own, or that in the story of telling the story with Henry, that my lips apparently were moving and I apparently wasn't moving them, but I was. The expression of the purity of that life force that was coming through, that was inviting me to say, oh, wait, maybe it's different than I'm perceiving. Maybe the way I've been holding on to my life isn't accurate. And do I want to keep this mask alive, or allow it to truly, die and have that source of life, rebirth it into something constructive? And it's been a journey. It's been a whole lot of fun. And these Beatitudes, if you are really interested in really studying and really practicing, they will change your life in a radical way. And Jesus was radical, right? And it was a radical idea at the time. And
well, I think that's why they turned it into Greek philosophy. Was, wait a minute, we got to cover this up. We got to get rid of this impetus towards something other than what the king wants. It's unfortunately true. Yeah, when he says in order for you to live, you've got to die, he's talking about that mask self, that non-being self, and making room for a total rebuild. And that's going to mean physiology as well. In the East, they call it kundalini. And they have this theory that it was an energy that resided in the base of the spine, that came up the spine and, did what it did. But in fact, what my take on what Kundalini is, I think they've misinterpreted in the East. Wherever there are dis-ease energies that are out of alignment with the perfect flow through this antenna structure called the body-mind unit, wherever it's out of alignment, there are blocks. And when we start to move toward alignment, then the blocks are going to start to move and be undone, and the energy will appear wherever the blocks are. So I've seen Kundalini energy appear in the base of the skull, in a foot, in a hand, in an arm. Actually, anywhere that there's injury or dis-ease, come into alignment, then a full complement of energy comes through, and it literally starts to punch through the disease processes, and it can be pretty intense. In the East, there's a whole lot of macho and a whole lot of sexual impropriety, and so where did they think the Kundalini came from was the base of the spine, because it was cracking through, breaking through sexual issues, held sexual energy that people had. But the truth is it can show up anywhere, and it will literally realign. When I hear you talking about going into that posture, your structure was saying, okay, so this is what we need to do to open that part of the antenna so that a full flow of energy will come through. And it's Rakhma, the first commandment was, and commandment in law, when they said, what's most important in the law, the Greek culture has us believing that law is the rule of a superior. And it's not the rule of a superior. Law is simply the way it works. So when they said to him, the question more accurately would have probably been, what do we have to do to function as humans? And he says, first order business. You've got to have Rakhma, that filtering the frontal lobes of the brain, that is the gateway for love to enter human life and keep your perceptual system on track with love. When you think of the Creator, when you think of neighbor, in order to maintain self. This is how we are restored to and maintain our human lives, which is the presence of love. And then the 10 most important words, if you look at, if you've got the Beatitudes posted there, the bottom line in that poster has the 10 most important words that he and anybody on earth have ever spoken. And what it says is, upon these 2 commandments hang the law and its prophets. So when you talked about, people who interpreted through the Greek and blah, blah, well, it was sort of there, but it wasn't really there what was going on. What he was saying is that in order to pick that book up that was called Scripture and understand it properly, you've got to have this connection to the eternal forces, and you need to be aligned with that. Otherwise, your carbon-based memory is going to interpret whatever's in carbon-based memory. And if the king wants you to believe that, well, what you're supposed to do is, you're supposed to be loving, but then when I tell you to go to war, you're supposed to go kill people. If that's what's been programmed in carbon-based memory, then people will take the scriptures and they'll read them a way that justifies war and killing. Because that's what's in carbon-based memory. But this, when you realize that being in alignment with the active presence of love, then you pick that book up, then you can come from the brain cells that Yeshua had when he spoke those thoughts. And of course, the Aramaic takes you closer and closer and closer to where you can more easily open to align with that understanding.
Well, and
the whole
along
thing
those
hangs
lines,
on. I was just going to say, the whole thing hangs on, literally, is the active presence of love, the predominant resonant energy that's alive in you. If it is, then you're going to be on track with what's in that book, and if not, you're going to project into it whatever's in carbon-based memory.
And I think that one of the things that you just highlighted was with the evidence that people have experienced in their physical life. One of the things that's in this carbon-based memory is the idea of suicide. And one of the things that I've experienced with dealing with people who have suicidal thoughts is that what they are, and I had suicidal thoughts and I had murderous thoughts back in 2011 when I was going through my whole mental health stuff. And as I really surrendered into this, it began to appear as this recognition that what I wanted to die of was this false idea of who I was. And it came up in the way of suicide. And then once I believed, which was also just kind of more of a false idea coming from an over-enthusiastic imagination, I wanted to believe that I was awakened fully at the time. And so I wanted other people to. And the idea that purposely, I guess, put into my head for maybe this conversation or maybe some of the other things I'll be teaching, but was this idea that I had to kill. And the idea of kill would cycle around. And someone who's experienced bipolar, which I did, and mania, those thoughts, they don't get softer. They get tighter and tighter and tighter unless they're interrupted. Goal canceling and a number of practices.
Forgiveness is definitely key.
support interrupting the cycle. And so one day, as I did a goal cancel on, like, cancel my goal to kill, right? And this is all in my head, but I'm processing it in that moment. And I finally got to a place I said, well, what does kill mean? And this whole storyline came out. It's like I had a perception that to kill would be to allow other people to have their first death and awaken. I mean, what a screwy idea, right? But that's how the carbon-based mind can misappropriate dialogue, readings, even from Scripture, like you said, because I got that from Scripture. You know, you won't taste the second death kind of thing. And the idea that started to surface for me over time is, oh my gosh, these concepts of murder and suicide, they're off, of course, and we can help get someone back online with these tools to support people in recognizing just consciously, like, oh, wait, what if it was true that you didn't actually want to leave the planet, but you actually just wanted to let go of the life that you have been living and have the full expression of that life force that wants to fully live come forward. And if someone could cognitively understand that that might be what it is, then we may have a lot more people saying, oh, sign me up. Like, let me do some more worksheets. You know, let me do some more mind shifters, you know, whatever it is, to help people shed those parts that aren't living in the purity of who we truly are.
So I'm thinking it's probably, Jeannie would probably have a better, she distinguishes one year from another better than I do, but about 15 years ago, we actually did a family trip to Hawaii, and we had planned it as part of doing some workshops there, and we spoke at Unity in Diamond Head, and we did a week of workshops, and we were going to be on the islands for a couple more weeks, and the Unity minister contacted us and said, you know, you guys are going to be here for a while longer. Will you come back and do another series? We just really got a lot of accolades out of that week of workshops, and we don't usually do that, go back to a place, you know, but 6 weeks later, it was actually kind of tough because we had to stay an extra 2 weeks in Hawaii in February. It was difficult, but we did it. But anyway, we went back and did another week-long series. Their Sunday service, another week-long series. And we had 3 people came to us and said, when I was here 6 weeks ago and did that Sunday forgiveness workshop, with 3 people who said they were planning their suicide. And that they were so delighted that they got the understanding and had no interest in suicide anymore. Had challenges, had some deep work to do, but were finished with suicide. So it's powerful when people get a hold of the tools and start to shift that carbon-based memory. And to me, just having the information, the knowledge that hostility and fear always is an indicator. It's like the warning signal from the creator. The carbon-based memory is offline, off base, and needs correction, needs healing. And that, you know, to listen to anything it has to say is just a gross error, and we need to get back in alignment with human life, the restoration of love, so that whatever is in carbon-based memory, if it's so far off base as to be that destructive, that energy can be transmuted or forgiven, can be removed from the structure. And going back through, I mean, we're talking about dealing with and healing generations and generations and generations of those kinds of dynamics. You know, we did an online codependence to interdependence communication practicum back a few months ago, and there's a young lady who's probably out there listening on the show right now, Magda, who in that intensive, she was dealing with some heart issues and was actually going to the hospital, and her assignment was to ask her generations about issues of the heart. And when she shared in the intensive what happened between her and her deceased grandfather as a result of a mind shifter around the issues of the heart and the generations, and then she called in the show. I'll send you a link to that show. It was about 20 or 25 minutes, but such a profound, and I mean, second time I heard it was when she called into the show and shared it, but left me in tears as she dealt with a grandfather who had come over from Europe and was, you know, ostensibly coming to the land of milk and honey and streets paved in gold, and found himself having to dig a hole in the ground for his family to have a hovel to live in, and the terror of, you know, were they going to have enough to eat, the crops, were they going to come in, and his abuse of his wife and his children. And it's just, I mean, it's such a powerful piece of work to open and be able to go to those generational patterns and heal them. Just, you know, monumental. And maybe, Jeannie, you could put a link to that in the notes, and I'll go ahead, Mark, and send you a link to that. You'll probably find it interesting. It's a powerful sharing.
I know we're getting close to the end. I was going to share one more story, but
go for it.
So this is a very personal story, but along those lines of kind of that suicidal ideation, because I know in the world today, I mean, the numbers are off the charts in terms of people who are struggling with mental health kind of challenges, anxiety, depression, etc. I mean, I think it's underreported, but the numbers are 4 times what they were just a couple of years ago. And a couple studies I've seen with hundreds of thousands of people have highlighted that about 80% of people are dealing with this. And suicidal ideation can come from a number of different areas. And I wanted to share this quick story where one of my children actually had been just angry and spouting off that he wanted to kill himself. And he said it enough that my wife, you know, after work one day, she's like, "Hey, you need to talk. He keeps saying this." So I sat him down and I said, "Well, what's going on?" Mom says, you're saying these things that you want to kill yourself. And he said, "Yeah." And I said, "Okay." And mind you, I'd been well trained in all this work, so I was able to stay present and cancel all my goals for him to live and all that stuff. So I was really there with him. And I said, "Well, what do you think is going to happen, you know, if you do that?" And he said, "Well, everything will be better," was his response. I said, "Well, what do you mean?" And he described his fantasy of what his life would be like after. And I said, "Okay, what if you're wrong?" to me. And because he hadn't considered that he might be wrong, because his perception from everything he had learned, the way he took in the information, was that this other place was going to be so much better than this place. And I said, "Yeah, what if you're wrong? What if you do that, the same work that you could do here in a body, you know, and actually get to the other side of it and live a full life? What if you still have to do that work wherever you go? What if that work doesn't go away?" And
Mark,
the conversation
the phone's
continued.
going to cut us off. The phone's going to cut us off, or the show, but maybe we can pick this up tomorrow if you've got the space.
Sure.
Okay, let's do it. Blessings, everybody.